I'm Amanda Knox, and you're listening to Hard Knox. Marcia, I'm so thrilled that you're here on Hard Knox. I've been so curious to talk to you for so long because we have this weird backwoods connection through awkward circumstances, and also I learned so much about you in this book, which surprised me. And so anyway, your new book is Trial by Ambush: Murder, Injustice, and the Truth About the Case of Barbara Graham. And I'm really excited to talk to you about it. First of all, can you tell me what brought you to this case and why you wanted to write about it?
It was an accident. I was looking at another case completely, and I had not heard of the Barbara Graham case. But once I did start looking into it, it was actually the first thing I thought was, I'm never going to write about this, because it was like its own case of the century, trial of the century. It was a big deal, got national coverage and a ton of local coverage by all the newspapers. And back then there were a ton of them, and they were all pretty tabloidy other than the the Los Angeles Times. I thought, well, everybody will have written about this for sure. And then I looked into it and realized, no, they hadn't. One person wrote about it who was one of the tabloid reporters back in the day in 1961. The murder happened in 1953, old case. But what I could see, even just from reading the newspapers before getting the transcripts of the trial, was that she was really just a decoy. She didn't look like or seem to have the criminal history of someone who would commit a brutal murder. This was a hideous murder. They pistol whipped an elderly woman in a home invasion robbery, and then strangled her to death. And it just didn't fit with her history at all. So that got me really intrigued, and, the ball started rolling from there.
Absolutely. I want to maybe go back a little bit and acknowledge some of the things that I learned from reading this book about you, because, and the reason I bring this up is because I think a lot of my listeners are going to be interested to learn these facts as well. For instance, that you are not just you don't just have a prosecutorial background, although most famously you have a, prosecutorial history with the O.J. Simpson case, but you also have worked as a public defender. And so you really have a good eye for both sides of the table. And you approached this story also because the prosecutor in this case was someone that you had you knew about, that you had looked up to when you were a young prosecutor. Can you tell me a little bit more about how your history informed your approach to this story?
Right. So I started as a defense attorney in private practice doing criminal law, and then shifted over to the prosecutor's office, which was not the way people usually do it because it's a big pay cut. But that was the way it went. That was what I wanted to do. And so in the DA's office in Los Angeles, an icon who was no longer in the office when I was there, he was way before my time, Miller Levy, was this kind of legendary figure that everybody talked about and kind of joked about, and every time somebody would lose a case, oh, Miller Levy could have won it, it was that kind of thing. So when I found out that he was the lead prosecutor in the case, I was excited to see my hero, my icon, in action. And then when I got my hands on the trial transcripts, all 4,000 pages of them, I was devastated to see that he really did a very underhanded, sleazy job of it. Some of this, I have to be fair, in all fairness, was allowed to be done by prosecutors. Some of the arguments he made, some of the evidentiary moves he made in court were allowed back then that would never be allowed today. That said, right, he did things that were not allowed back then either, and it was hideous. And he particularly targeted Barbara. And the most misogynistic remarks, sexist remarks I've ever seen anyone make in a court of law, and actually told the jury in the closing argument, talked to the men on the jury and said, she only took the stand and testified to turn your heads, to seduce you, and make you vote not guilty just because she's so pretty. And she was beautiful, by the way. So that did not help her, actually. So, it was really ugly, ugly stuff. And I do think that ultimately the malfeasance is what caused her to be executed in the gas chamber.
Ugh. Okay. Yes. So, you know, note to everyone involved, like just a quick recap of what this story is. As you mentioned, there is this armed, robbery in this woman's house. There's a number of people involved. Barbara is one of them, but she and three other men, correct?
Yes, actually four.
Yes. Four
Yeah,
other men, yes, but one of them didn't make it to trial. That's right. And
right.
if you can read the book to find out why. But so four men, one woman attack this elderly lady in her home, pistol whip her, strangle her to death. Terrible, terrible, terrible. And then when the case goes to trial, we have every reason to believe that Barbara was the sort of least culpable of all of these figures that were involved. And yet she becomes the center of the case. She becomes the one who is targeted by the prosecution as the most active and the most culpable of all of the figures involved. She becomes targeted, and as a result of that, ends up, getting the death penalty and is executed. Looking back at this case in particular, you've made the argument that had she been tried today, a different case could have been made to save her life by her defense attorneys. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, today in California, a defense attorney would first of all argue that she could only be tagged for participating in the robbery and the burglary, and that she was not guilty of murder because she was not a major participant. She was just a decoy. She was used by them to get the victim to open the door. Mabel Monahan, the victim, was an elderly woman who had been very security conscious. They knew who she was, and they knew she would never open the door to a man. So they used Barbara, who was petite, beautiful, young, and very unthreatening. And sure enough, she got Mabel to open the door by saying her car had broken down. Could she use the phone? They didn't have cell phones back then. So that was really her role. Now, the accomplice who wound up getting the sweetheart deal of complete immunity, who was the one who actually did participate in the murder, claimed that he didn't, claimed that Barbara was the one who did the pistol whipping, and he just stood there trying to protect the victim, which was bullshit. But there was no one to contradict him. Barbara wasn't talking. The other men certainly weren't going to talk, and so she wound up taking the heat for it. But her lawyer would have argued he's a liar. She didn't do any of that. She did participate as a decoy, and she's only guilty of robbery. And that would have been the claim. Or at a bare minimum, even if you convict her of murder, she certainly doesn't deserve the death penalty. And I don't think there's a chance in hell she would have been executed in today's world.
Absolutely. So I'm wondering if you could talk to me about why the DA's fixation on Barbara. What is your read on that? What was going on in the DA's office at the time that led them to think we want to go after the decoy and give a sweet immunity deal to the guy who very likely participated in the actual slaughtering of a human being?
Amanda, I have a lot of theories. That's all I can give you are theories, because I don't know exactly what made him target her the way he did. He went after her like he went after none of the other defendants. And I think that's in part because those two other men looked like exactly what they were. Really vicious thugs. Emmett Perkins and Jack Santos were just monstrous. And they had killed others, and they wound up getting other death penalty verdicts as well in other jurisdictions. So there was no challenge to them. She was the get. And she was the one the press focused on. So she was the one he had to get in order to be the celebrated hero. I think that's put the target on her back more than anything. She was beautiful. She was young. She had no criminal history really to speak of other than really misdemeanor stuff, weed, a little bit of prostitution, that sort of thing. No violent crime whatsoever. Someone who is typical on the fringes of society with no skills and winds up doing one thing or another to get by. So this is not somebody you can look at and say, oh, she's a murderer. But he demonized her at every bend and turn, and the papers were only too happy to help him, sensationalizing her every move, every look, every breath she took was reported, and she was constantly framed as the villainess, this cold-hearted, icy blonde kind of thing. And so from jump and nonstop, I mean, up to the point where she's walking into the gas chamber and they're describing what she's wearing as though she's on a shopping trip. And it was disgusting. So I think that it was really, she's a hard one to get, and therefore that was the brass ring.
Yeah. I want to linger on this point just because it's very personal for me, because I don't even know how much you actually have followed my case at all. Did you ever follow my case at all, or look into it at all?
Minimally. Yeah,
Okay.
minimally. And I'm sorry to say minimally, but only because from what little I read from the very beginning, I thought, what the fuck? Oh, sorry.
It's okay. It's a podcast. You can do whatever you want. It's the Wild
Yeah,
West.
that's right. It struck me as there was no case there. There was no basis for you being there. And I get too upset.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I hear
and I get
you.
frustrated, you know what I mean? So I just I can't even. And then some of the things that the prosecutor was saying, it's like, what the hell is going on here? It was pretty upsetting for me. So why don't you stop that? I just couldn't. I really had a hard time with what little I did see. And so I kind of stepped away from it. So I didn't watch it exhaustively, but how much you got focused on, I couldn't miss it. And that was unfair. And that was horrifying in and of itself. Even if you'd been guilty, there was somebody else sitting next to you. There were a couple of other people involved here, at the scene, so to speak, who lived there and were there. And it just, it seemed unfair right from the start. That then when I saw, what little I saw of the evidence, it was just completely outrageous. So.
Yeah, I mean, I bring it up because one of the things that's really, bothered me to this day about the case that I experienced was how little the truth seemed to matter compared to the story that was being crafted by the prosecution and recycled through the media, the scandalous story, like the thing that really happened to my roommate, which was horrific, just like the thing that happened to this poor old woman, Mabel, was horrific. And it mattered to get it right and to say definitively what really happened. And the choice of the prosecutor to completely just dismiss or overlook the obvious culprit in favor of going after the young, pretty girl, like that's the thing. Like it's not a perfect comparison, obviously, because, Barbara was at least minimally involved in this crime. So like there is that aspect of it. But like the insistence on making this, in her case, a minimally involved person, and in my case, a non-involved person, the center of the entire investigation and trial. I just, for me, I couldn't understand it because I was like, why are you overlooking all of the evidence that is pointing towards other individuals who are way more likely, and of the evidence that we have available, are involved? Like, why take the word of some thug over this woman? Like, I just don't like. I'm trying to understand the motivation. And I feel like when approaching your book, like that was the thing that I really came away from. Like, was it simply just because it was more of a challenge? Like, did he need Barbara to be the center of his story and the ice queen and, the villain that he created in order to make a case against her? Like, why go after her so intensely, so viciously? Why ambush her, as you say?
Yeah. And so I agree with you. I mean, that stuck in my craw as well. The only thing I can say is that because the press chose to go after her, because she was the clickbait, so to speak, of her time, right? Mm-hmm. She did not look like someone who would be charged with such a heinous crime. And so that's what the press always goes after. What is sensational? What is it? Where's the man bites dog story? And she was that. And you were that. You don't look like what you're being charged with. And when you have that kind of mismatch, that's what gets eyeballs on the story. That's what gets people to subscribe, to click, you got it. And I think when he saw that, it became more and more important for him to win that one. The one who doesn't look like she deserves it, that's the get. And that's the one that's going to be hard to prove. So he had to demonize her. He had to do all that he could to prove, oh, she might look like this, but she's really that. And that became his whole raison d'etre when he going after her. And he never let up. And it was hideous. I mean, that it totally distorted justice. Now, it is different because she was involved. You weren't. It was that much worse in your case because it was just purely that. He saw a good story, a very sensational story. The press was going after it. I'm convinced. You, again, did not look like who they were trying to say you were and what you did. And so that makes for a very big story, gossip column, endless stories and things to talk about. Wow, she did this today. She did that today. You know, I mean, it's just, I do think that it's because the press has that focus. The prosecutor then says, well, that's the one I got to get.
Yeah, so it's almost, okay, I'm hearing you. It's the challenge itself that sort of motivates a DA to double down and to go and to really double their efforts towards the person that they know is the most questionable, but also the most interesting. Okay, I mean,
the most interesting, the one that's getting all the press, the one that everybody's interested in, and the one that everybody would predict would not be convicted or would never have done this. Going after that one, winning that one, gives you the big crown. You know, you're the king. It's awful. I mean, there's a prosecutor's joke. You know, it's easy to convict the guilty. The hard one, the challenge is to get the innocent. You know, that's a joke. It's not meant to be real. You know, so the fact that they do it, and the fact that they, in your case, really did it, it's just unthinkable, really.
I wonder if we can talk a little bit about public scrutiny and how I feel like, you know, all the women in this room, me, you, and Barbara, have borne the weight of it, the significant weight of it, and in a very specific way as women. Can you talk to me about how your own experiences and also looking into Barbara's case, what thoughts you have about public scrutiny and the role of the media in justice?
You know, whenever a woman appears in a role that people don't normally see women in, there's a tendency for the press to go, you know, focus on that. Again, that's the clickbait. That is the thing that doesn't match. That is the thing that is unusual. And so when a woman is involved, whether it's being accused of a crime or whether prosecuting a crime, especially back when I was prosecuting Simpson, although women had been in our office prosecuting death penalty cases for a number of years, the public hadn't seen it. So you have someone who's in the lead prosecuting role in a big high profile case, and it was something unusual. And so there's too much attention being paid. And then they were allowed to as well. The judge exercised no discretion in terms of the access that they had to the courtroom. And that was a bad thing, a very bad thing. And judges really need to be, and are today, much better about that, I must say. Because really a camera should, if you have a jury trial going on, the cameras should not be in the courtroom when the jury is not in the courtroom. And that's that. And I think that also, you know, even seeing people moving around in the courtroom, and it's happened to you in Italy, being able to see people moving around in the courtroom is an entrancing thing for the public. You know, they don't usually see what's going on in court in real trials, although nowadays they do, of course. But, and that in itself kind of skews public opinion and also gives the chance for the press to weigh in with spin, basically. And a lot of the tabloids are particularly guilty of this, as you know. So, you know, I think that's problematic, though. I think we're probably moving into an era where we're going to be less surprised at seeing at least women prosecuting cases or defending cases. But I think that in terms of focusing on a defendant who doesn't seem to be what they are accused of, or a defendant who has done something like Koberger that is so outrageous, it's hard to believe anyone could do such a thing. That's always going to get the press excited. It's always going to get a lot of attention.
Right. And what about this femme fatale character? What about this, cold-hearted, evil, tempestuous, bloody Babs like character? Like is this simply just coming from movies? Is this like an idea of a person that's in like noir films? Like I'm trying to, I have a joke about how like my prosecutor came up with my character and like the character of Foxy Noxy in the courtroom. And it's like, well, it's informed by a lifetime of Italian soap operas. Like we're talking about something cartoonish in nature. And yet the public seems really interested and fixated on identifying a female that fits this archetype that is, very much a cartoonish kind of character. Can we talk about like how Barbara was described and, described in utterly fictional terms, and yet it still was something that was appetizing to the public. Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, look, Raymond Chandler sells. Dashiell Hammett sells. These people sell. These noir stories and all of the Italian soap operas sell, don't they? I mean, they're huge. So, there's a built-in appetite for a character who seems to be something that you've only read about in fiction. But of course, the fiction is so attractive and so exciting. And then you have a character that you can kind of layer that fiction on top of and say, they are brought to life. Oh, it's real. It's not just a soap opera. There really is a character, Foxy Noxy, Bloody Babs, and the prosecutors got the ball rolling with Bloody Babs. That was the other prosecutor, Adolph Alexander, started in his opening statement. The vilification began early on, and the press went running with that ball constantly throughout the trial, and that became the thing. And so she was absolutely fictionalized, cartoonized, if you will. And I think women in particular, in these situations, always kind of wind up being fictional characters, as happened to you as well. And that's because there's a symbiotic thing where the prosecutor involved wants to encourage that kind of fictionalization because it's easier to demonize someone like that. You can paint any colors you want inside those lines because the public is already ready and eager to see the soap opera character, the villainous, the cold-hearted, whatever, at Bloody Babs, Foxy Noxy. You can fill in those blanks with any colors you like and make this person into someone who can be convicted. So I think that has a lot to do with the impetus for doing it, as well as the reason why the public goes for it.
I'm wondering if we can talk about like some of the things that you're hoping your readers will take away from your book as in terms of like just a better understanding about the justice system or about the media or about just what it's like to be a woman in the world. Like what are some of those takeaways that you're hoping readers will come away with having rediscovered, or in many cases just discovered Barbara's story?
I kind of really hope, because I think that this is an evergreen, I kind of think these are all evergreen issues. And so I'm hoping that when people read this, they will kind of pull back from the efforts in the press and the media to demonize any particular figure. Think about the layers and the gray areas that you don't know. Don't suppose you know that the truth about a person and what they did just based on what you read in a tabloid or see in a few minutes on camera with somebody commenting who maybe has their own agenda and their own desire for spin, just to get clickbait, just to get eyes on them. Think carefully about what you're seeing and be skeptical. I want people to be skeptical, be curious and be skeptical about what you're being given. Don't accept blindly the picture that's being painted for you. Think about what you're getting. Think about if things don't seem to match up, maybe there's a reason for that. And if things seem too good or too bad to be true, maybe they are.
And I'm wondering if, for those prosecutors and law enforcement professionals who read your book, what are you hoping that they will take away from it?
Really the same thing. Resist the temptation to consider the defendant a two-dimensional character who existed only to commit crimes, who had no thought in his head for anything else. Consider the possibility that when he says he acted in self-defense, maybe it's at least partly true. Consider these possibilities and don't reject out of hand just because it's a defendant. And for the same thing, and from the defense side, do not assume that just because this cop is testifying that he saw you do whatever, or he questioned you in such a way that he's out to get you and he's thinking only of a notch in his belt. Maybe he just really thinks you're guilty. Maybe he's just really trying to do his job. It's important for everyone to consider both sides, consider all sides. I've seen too, because I was a prosecutor and when I look at these cases, especially all the appellate cases I handle, I can't help but look at what the prosecution has done, because I'm looking in this position as an appellate lawyer, looking for the errors in a trial. And I can't help but look at, on occasion, it doesn't happen a lot. There's a lot of good prosecutors out there doing a very good job, and cops too, doing a very good job and trying to do a good job and a fair job. But there are times that I have looked at at the attitude, which is a get 'em at all costs mentality, and thought, nope, no, you're missing it. You're missing the truth of this case. You're missing the truth of this defendant. So I would encourage everyone. I'm hoping that this book, whoever does read it, thinks about these things, because I think Barbara got painted into a corner from day one and never really got a fair shake.
It occurs to me that one of the things that you're describing, which is a problem that we see over and over again in the way justice is administered, is that it is so adversarial. Like you mentioned before, that you would love to see people who are working in prosecution to work on the defense side of the things, and vice versa, so people can get a sense of what it's like to work both sides of the system, because it feels like it seems like if you're on one track, you're going to do everything you possibly can to be as harsh as humanly possible, and if you're on the other track, you're trying to get away with everything as much as humanly possible. Instead, and what gets sacrificed in the course of administering justice this way is the truth, which is way more complex. It doesn't really fit in any one of those tracks. Like how can we, are we just screwed because the way that our system is set up insofar that it is adversarial? Is there any way in an adversarial system for the truth to actually be paramount instead of just winning your side by any means necessary at all cost? Is that possible?
Oh, yeah, and it happens all the time, because largely the prosecutors I've seen, and I've now seen thousands, they do a good job. They go in, they do the fair thing, they do the right thing, they put on a clean case. They don't try to, jam in inflammatory evidence that doesn't belong on the record. They just present the evidence. They do a good job, they do a fair job, and then the jury can find the truth of the case. The jury can get there. And then you have a judge. Let's not forget that there's a judge. And the judge decides what can come in, what can come out. And the judge is there to control both sides and make sure that nobody goes too far off the rails. Largely, they do. Largely, they do the right thing. Sometimes it doesn't work out that way. But largely, it does happen that way. And juries, for the most part, do come to the right decision. There's going to be, we're human. And so humans make mistakes, and they're flawed. And so juries can be bamboozled. They can be misled. They can be, influenced for better, for worse. But largely, for the majority of cases, the truth does seem to win out. The juries do seem to come to the right decision. Then the judges do seem to be able to manage the courtroom so that the truth does have a chance to be revealed.
I'm wondering about the media's role in all of that. How could the media facilitate the truth as the paramount goal as opposed to the sensationalized version? Because again, it feels like fundamentally there is a like foundational obstacle where if your entire industry is based upon getting as much attention and as much clicks as humanly possible, then the clickbait version of the story is always going to win over the more complex, nuanced, considered, truthful version of the story.
Yeah.
Wah, wah, like,
That's all I
too
can say
bad.
is right on, Amanda. Because it does. I mean, that is what happens. I do think that people gravitate. It's easier to read the clickbait. It's easier to read the sensational headline. He's a demon. He's an asshole. You know, that kind of thing. And that grabs the eyes. It's easy to consume. It's black and white. It's very binary, and it's easy to assimilate. We don't have to think about it. You don't have to think about what's true and what's not true. They tell you what's true. And so that's always going to be attractive to people because people have lives and they want to think about other things and they have to think about other things. They've got kids, they've got groceries, they've got husbands and wives. And so, you know, they have how many utils of attention for any given case that they see being sensationalized. And it's much more fun to gossip about a case than it is to talk about the legal issues and the truth and parse through all of the threads and try to untangle the Gordian knot that is sometimes these cases that present this and then that and this and then that. And it's really hard to do. And so people aren't going to spend the time to do that for the most part. So, you know, all I can say is I don't think this is a problem that we can solve. You know, there will be always some who are very intent on making sure that they tell the truth and they give a balanced, nuanced picture of things. And the answer to the public is seek out those guys and try to avoid the screaming headlines of the tabloids. And it's up to the consumer, really, to decide what they're going to pay attention to and what they're going to believe. And if you want to believe the tabloid that shows the woman giving birth to a 15-pound pineapple, just understand what you're reading, you know, and realize, okay, I just read a bunch of nonsense. That was a fun story. I'm not going to decide that, therefore, women can give birth to pineapples. So,
Right. I'm wondering about the psychology at heart behind, you know, especially I want to go back to like Barbara's case, because putting yourself in DA Levy's shoes, what do you think that he believed the story that he was telling about Barbara? Or do you think that he knowingly was misrepresenting her as the femme fatale that he had, and, you know, who was pistol whipping an old lady, even though she didn't have a gun on her? Like, do you think he believed that story, or was he just telling the story that he thought he needed to tell to win?
So I just thought about that so much, you know, Amanda. Did he really buy his own bullshit, or did he just very cynically decide to spin the tale that he knew would win? I could not decide. I think I want to believe that he believed it. I want to believe that he really thought all this. I want to believe that back in 1953, there were these prejudices and these attitudes that were very binary. You know, guilty, not guilty. She did it all. She did nothing. You know, and so that he fell into that thinking too, because that's just the way things were back then. Nuance was not particularly. That was not a word that got bandied around a lot back then. And I think that, especially if you believed in the noir stories and the writers, you know, you have a tendency to think that way.
What, you know, you talk in the book about some of the things that, you know, prosecutors and law enforcement professionals were allowed to do back then that they are not allowed to do today. Like, you know, put a police officer undercover into a police, you know, or into a jail cell with a defendant, all of that. I'm wondering, though, if there are things that you can identify that are happening today that you think in 20, 30, 40 years we'll look back on and cringe that the police and law enforcement are allowed to do today.
Well, much less so. That said, though, back in the day, back when J. Miller Levy was trying the case, they were allowed to comment on a defendant's invocation of the right to remain silent. So they could say to the jury, well, if you're so innocent, why did you demand the right to remain silent? Why did you stand on your Fifth Amendment right? Why didn't you talk to the cops? They were allowed to say all that. Today, you're not allowed to do that. But some prosecutors still do. And in fact, one prosecutor very famously did in the case of Nora Jackson in Memphis, Tennessee, when the prosecutor got up in closing argument and said, Nora, tell us where you were. Why won't you tell us where you were? A direct comment on the fact that she invoked her right to remain silent. So, I mean, that's what we call Griffin error after Griffin versus California. And that case came down in the 60s. So it had not yet been decided. But even though it's on the books for, decades now, you can still see that a prosecutor gets up and violates the rule. So there are things that I'm sure we do. Cops are today allowed to use what we call a ruse. That is, they interview you after you're arrested. You're sitting in the interview room with them. You're handcuffed to the table. They can tell you, we've got your prints. We've got your DNA. We've got your hair. We even have surveillance camera footage that shows that you were at the scene. You did the murder. And it's a lie. But they're allowed to. And they're allowed to lie to the defendant because the theory is, I mean, unless you're really browbeating someone, unless somebody, other forces are being brought to bear, a simple lie about the amount of evidence you have is not going to induce a normally innocent person to admit that they did it. I'm wondering whether that kind of practice is going to be allowed 20, 30 years from now. I'm wondering. Because there is such a thing, although I think it's rare, to have a false confession. That a defendant can feel like he just gives up and says, I did it, because he feels like the whole world is against him, even though he didn't do it, and just feels like it's hopeless. And so if that is something that people look at, if they determine that false confessions are more frequent than we think as a result of that practice, that might be one that goes by the wayside.
You know, I do have one question for you, because, we've talked about how you know, DA J. Miller Levy was your idol at one point in your life. I don't know if you would say that today, would you?
No way.
Yeah. Right.
No. That has changed. So, can I ask you a question, though?
Sure, yeah. You
met with your prosecutor not so long ago. How was that? Why was that? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so, when I ask you the question, do you think that, Levy really believed the things that he was saying about Barbara, or if he was just cynically saying what he needed to say and spinning it like he needed to spin it to win his case? I was really haunted by that question too. Like, did my prosecutor even care whether or not I was innocent? Or did he find himself in a situation where he was under international scrutiny and certain, decisions were made hastily, and then the evidence said otherwise, and he just dug in his heels? And I wanted, as someone whose entire life was upended by certain decisions that a man in a position of incredible power, I wanted to know why, and I wanted to know if he cared. I wanted to know if he truly believed his bullshit, or if he was cynical. And I too, was like you, where I wanted to believe that he really believed it, that he somehow, just by virtue of his upbringing and his background and his, unconscious bias, thought he was doing the right thing. I really wanted to believe that, because then I wouldn't hate him. And I think that would maybe give me more insight into why wrongful convictions happen in the first place, because I really don't think it's because prosecutors are all cynical and they don't care if you're guilty or innocent or not. Like, I think they do care, but I think that they get caught up in their own stories, and, you know, consciously or unconsciously, their egos get involved and they believe in themselves so much that they stop, you know, having a rational, you know, objective point of view. And so when I went out to encounter my prosecutor, I really was wondering if, by encountering him outside of the adversarial justice system in which we had first encountered each other, we might be able to recognize each other's humanity in a way that we hadn't previously been capable of. And, you know, I'm still, to this day, wondering, because, you know, in the way that a prosecutor might wonder, like, what does the evidence tell me about what was this person's intention behind the decisions that he made? And I think I've come around to I have come around to the position that he believed in what he was doing. He still, you know, believes in what he was doing. And he just, you know, got caught up in his own story. But he didn't have malicious intent. But then there are other moments where I'm like, how could you have made this mistake? Like, this was not a small overlooking of, you know, all of the evidence that pointed to my innocence. Like, this, as my family would like to point out, this screams of more than just incompetence. And so, you know, depending on the day, I'm still thinking about it. But, you know, I also, you know, every day am in communication with my prosecutor, who has since developed this very, like, open-hearted, it's hard to describe what our relationship is, because it's not exactly a friendship per se, although it has many of the qualities of what a friendship sort of looks like checking in on each other, you know, keeping each other up to date on what's going on, you know, being open with, you know, about our feelings. Like, I think the thing that I was really striving for was the opportunity to, you know, stand up for myself and confront him, but also accept him as the human being that he really is, and to really try to do him justice by giving him the benefit of the doubt that he had denied me. So, you know, it's a complicated answer to your question, but it all kind of goes back to that question that I asked you about Levy, is like, what is going on? Like, what is going on in a man who spins an absurd tale that has no basis in the evidence? And what is going on with the media that is just spinning obvious fiction that is a recycled version of some comic book that they read, you know, last night? Like, what is going on there? And why do people believe it? That's...
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an addiction to the salacious that we will never cure. And I think that, so when a prosecutor is inclined, or anyone is inclined to tell a very salacious story that titillates you know, hits all of the soft and gushy spots and gets people excited, they're going to go for it. And there's a kind of, it's like crack, you know? You're not going to get people to not do that, to not go for it. Unless you make them aware of it. And that's why I think, you know, you're coming out talking like you do. And I think that your reason for having contact with him now makes much more sense to me. than it did before because I hated him. So
I mean, and I had every reason to hate him too.
yeah.
And I think that I don't like the feeling of hate. First of all, it's a feeling that I have aversion for. So I'm always trying to find loopholes to get around hating people. Like, can I just like them a little bit? Can I just, I just can't, like, I can't deal with like the whole hatred thing. It just feels so wrong and icky and bad. But yeah, I don't know. It feels like your book sort of triggered or pinged a lot of questions for me about my own experience and about things that I'm still trying to wrap my mind around when I approach, criminal justice reform. Like you mentioned, false confessions and police interrogation techniques, like, deception in a custodial interrogation, the ruse, is something that I have been advocating against in my local, government, because I know from experience as adult, not cognitively declined human being, that the ruse that was put towards me made me feel crazy. It was literal gaslighting that made me question my own understanding of reality. And as a result, I falsely confessed. And so, like, I'm trying to make that argument to law enforcement who, the response that I get is, well, we can't do our job without it. And it's like, well, I wonder if the same police officers back in the day with Barbara would have said the exact same thing. We can't do our job without, showing up and sneaking around and doing ruses in jail cells. Like, can you help me? Like, how do I communicate to someone across the aisle to convey the truth of these complicated issues that we tend to take such an adversarial stance about?
Yeah, I mean, I really think, because it's tough, Amanda. I mean, it's really hard to get people to step into the middle. They call it no man's land for a reason. Should we say it no person's land? But but I really think it's not a good place to be. You get shot at from both sides. Nevertheless, that's where we have to meet, is in the middle, where we accept that each side has something to offer and something that can be relied upon as true. It doesn't mean that everything is true. It doesn't mean that everything is false. And so the willingness to accept gray areas and compromise and see the other person's point of view is where we have to be. And I don't think we can do that unless we share our personal stories, your story, your being able to explain what it felt like to be gaslit like that, where you're getting pounded on and you're in vulnerable circumstances. This is where false confessions come from. When someone has no more, all the defenses are broken down and anything can be believed. Up is down is up. That kind of disorientation, you can see where that can happen. And then a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. I mean, you'll do anything to make it stop. So that's the kind of thing. You tell your story. I mean, which you are, and very well and very eloquently. And I think that's how we change minds and get people to accept the possibilities, because these cases that now stand for propositions that were not in existence in Barbara's time, they happened for this reason, because people were telling their stories and showing how injustice can happen, how the truth can get buried and fairness thwarted as a result of these kind of tactics that really you don't need to prove your case. And I think it in particular upsets me when prosecutors do these things, having been one. And I know the power a prosecutor has. And so I was always willing to listen to the defense. And it does have a lot to do with the fact that I was a defense attorney. And so I knew, there is another side to this. And there is there's going to be some truth on that side. So what do you want to tell me? And what can we work out here? And largely, they do. I mean, plea bargaining is a thing, and it happens a great deal. And it happens for the most part. People demonize it a lot and say, it's terrible, and it causes people to confess to plead guilty when they shouldn't. But it also causes people, for the most part, the vast majority of the time, to plead guilty to something less than they would have gotten had they gone to trial. So they do get a better deal out of it. And that's because they're working together. And that's because a prosecutor says, hey, look, I can see that your guy's saying this, that, and the other. Part of that's probably true. Maybe he doesn't deserve first degree. Maybe it should be second degree, that sort of thing. And then they meet. And I think that it's only when people communicate and talk about what they've been through, and people need to listen as well, then you can start to make inroads into the way things have always been, which doesn't necessarily mean they should still be.
How often, so you mentioned that prosecutors should spend some time at the defense table and defense attorneys should spend some time at the prosecutor's table. How often does one in one's career in that field cross those lines? Or is it typical for people to just be a prosecutor their entire life and be a defense attorney their entire life?
The common way that it happens is that people start in the prosecutor's office and then go out into private practice and become defense attorneys. So usually it's for money because, when you're a prosecutor, you're a government employee, you don't get paid a lot. You may have job satisfaction, you're taking care of the victims, that sort of thing, and you do have power to do the right thing, which is, good. And I think I was motivated by that myself, having started as a defense attorney and seen what a good prosecutor did, and having the power to do the right thing for defense attorneys, for all involved, was attractive. But usually it's the other way, and they go into private practice from the prosecutor's office, but they don't go back again. And most defense attorneys remain defense attorneys. Very seldom do they become prosecutors. Like I said, it's a big pay cut. So, I think if it were required that for you to spend as part of your law school experience, go and spend 2 years on the prosecution side, and then go and spend 2 years on the defense side, and then you get to choose. It's kind of like the way doctors have residency and that sort of thing. It certainly would cut down on the number of lawyers we have. They'd be a long time before you actually make a living.
Yeah, that's interesting that you put it in terms of the economics of it, because what about the public defenders though?
That would be the way to do it. You're right. That would be the way to do it. Public defender for 2 years, prosecutor for 2 years, then go with God. Choose what you want to do.
And what about those who become judges? What is the career trajectory for that, typically?
You start out as either defense attorney or a prosecutor, or as my law, and then in case you think it requires some great acumen to become a judge, as my law school torts professor said, what is a judge, children? A judge is a lawyer who knows the governor. So it's a matter of connections or running for office.
Okay, interesting. I'm just curious because I do think that there's something to this idea that you just get in your lane, and it becomes a kind of bubble. Here is your little bubble of people that you are on your side, and how often is it that prosecutors and defense attorneys are mingling with each other even? Is there any kind of behind the scenes social interaction, or is everyone very strictly in their lane? I'm trying to figure out where this no man's land even exists, and where is that space possible?
Oh, it happens every day.
Okay.
When I was a prosecutor, I'd go to court, and my calendar deputy, that would be the deputy who runs that courtroom, we'd be running through all the cases, and we'd be talking to defense attorneys all day long about what's going to go to trial, what's going to settle, and then when you're in trial, who you're going to call your next witness, that sort of thing. And then you're litigating, you're together all the time, talking constantly to the other side. Do we socialize? Some do. Some really do. I'm trying to think, is it common? I don't know. I did. But
I'm just curious because you mentioned, trying that police and prosecutors need to try to see both sides. And yet if they're interacting with defense attorneys every day and socializing even with defense attorneys, then why aren't they seeing both sides? Why are they taking this, go for the person, get the notch in your belt. Like, why? Like, I don't get it.
But not all of them do. Not
Okay.
all of them do. There's a powerful number of prosecutors who are very chummy with the defense bar and are easily able to get along. And I can see it in the cases that I work on all the time. So no, some don't. Some don't. It would be a mistake to say the majority don't. They do. Largely, they do get along. Largely, they do communicate. That's how they move a calendar. You have this caseload that's enormous. If we don't talk, you have a log jam, and it's an impossible log jam. So they do. But yes, there will always be diehards on both sides. Defense attorneys that can only see prosecutors as the devil, and prosecutors who can only see the defendant as the devil, or defense attorneys as the devil. So you know what I mean? There will always be those extremists, but there's a vast majority that mix in the middle that actually do see each other's point of view and get along and manage to handle cases together in a very civil way. So it's not like this is the majority at all. But the problem is when you see the big sensational case, the headlines don't talk about the fact that we're all talking with each other behind the scenes. I talk to defense attorneys behind the scenes all the time. And we're joking around in chambers, and that's always happening. You don't see it because when we go out into court, you have to behave, you know. Mm-hmm. But so you have to remember that you're not seeing everything.
Okay.
You're skeptical.
Interesting. No. Oh, no. I mean, I'm just like, I'm taking advantage. Honestly, I'm taking advantage of the opportunity of having someone who's had a career in this field to like really understand what is happening behind the scenes, because I only saw it from a very specific position. And ever since having had that utterly traumatic experience in the courtroom, I've never wanted to voluntarily enter a courtroom again. I get nervous even being outside of courthouses because I just like all of those horrible memories are triggered. And so, but that means that like I don't really have access to like what it's like to navigate these spaces as someone who has a very specific role, and like it's almost like a team sport. Like I wonder even if it like triggers that tribal mentality of like, you know, I'm on team blue and you're on team red and we just hate each other by definition. Like, and for me, like as someone who just wanted the truth to come out and wanted to just have my life back, I felt like I was often just like a pawn in somebody else's bigger game. All these people are playing, you know, soccer and I'm the ball, and they're just kicking me around, trying to get me into one goal or the other. And I'm like, I shouldn't even be here. Like, that's how it felt for me. So I guess like as an outsider who suddenly found myself right in the middle of this game, I'm trying to understand it. And, you know, you've played on both sides. And so I'm like eager to sort of pick your brain about the mentality of all these players, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, you were in a very unusual situation where you had a prosecutor who was way out in left field, believing a fairy tale in his head that had no basis in reality. And that's so crazy, I can't even find the words to describe it, the craziness of that. And then and then everybody has their own, when they go to their corners like that, it's bad news. Really bad news. And you have a prosecutor who's divorced from reality. This is a very unusual situation you're talking about. And of course, you feel like a pawn in their game because you are getting kicked around where he's fantasizing his own world and the defense is trying to fight for reality and truth. And the twain are not going to meet. But that's not common at all. That's really not the way it usually goes. Even when we disagree, we're not living in La La Land like that. And so, you know, your situation was so specific and unique. I don't know how you lived through it. Thank God you did. But, you know, but don't extrapolate try not to extrapolate because it really isn't like that in the vast, vast majority of cases where it's more like there is a kind of sense of team spirit that kind of does unite both sides in the usual situation where we know we're going to disagree with each other. I'm going to prosecute. You're going to defend. I'm going to respect your need to do so. Please respect mine. And I'm not going to step out of the lines. And I'm going to seek the truth. And you can disagree with it, but I'm not going to go crazy and make up stuff. You know what I mean? And there's kind of that understanding that we will collaborate that way. And then even if we step out of line, there's a judge who's going to stop us from stepping out of line. But none of that happened for you. So I can understand very well why you would be so traumatized by an experience that was insane. I mean, if you made a movie of this without saying it was based on a true story, no one would believe it. So, I mean, it's totally understandable why you would never want to step foot in court again. And you never will. So, unless you want to.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I just think it's so as someone who has spent their, whole adult life in and out of courtrooms, and when you're not in a courtroom, you're reading trial transcripts. I just find that fascinating and also like my version of hell. So it's just like,
yeah, I can see that.
But like, that's your thing, like that, that's what and I mean, are you ever going to give yourself a break, or are you just going to be like in one way or another with your head in a courtroom and in a case for as long as you are tooling around?
Yep. Probably so. I think that I'm long-term addicted, and so now I'm doing true crime, but I'm also going to go back to fiction, and because that's more fun, really. And
what is it about the courtroom that like grabs hold of you?
I don't know. Is it the courtroom itself? I think the stories.
I mean, there's something about the trial, right? Like you talked in the book about how like the trial is where you really like dig down and you like figure out what's really going on. What is it about the trial? Why
it's the search
the trial?
For the truth. The search for the truth. I mean, that's really, I think what intrigues me the most is the truth, finding the truth, no matter what it is. And the stories involved and the people involved, all of it's fascinating. And it tends to be the most dire of circumstances. I mean, I've only done homicides now for most of my life. So that is the most extreme behavior. And so why does someone do this? And why would someone, the why of it all, I think, is what keeps me fascinated. The courtroom is where we can explore, what's true, and you get to hear, hopefully, both sides of the story. But these stories are endlessly fascinating to me, I think, because it's always a search for the truth. And that to me is kind of an endless fascination.
And when you say both sides of the story, like I'm curious to talk about like how and when you in your career have found yourself in agreement with the defense and in disagreement, and how that, like in a civil, when everyone's playing fair, like let's take away the extreme examples like my case. When everyone's playing fair, what does it look like when the prosecution and the defense are in agreement of the facts, but are in disagreement of the interpretation of those facts?
That's hard to say, because usually then you're talking about a question of degree. When you talk about the interpretation of those facts, you're usually not talking about whether or not he or she did it. You're talking about what they did. That is always the most interesting thing, right? First degree, second degree, is it defensive? Is it manslaughter? Is it self-defense?
So intent, like getting into the mind of the person. Interesting.
Intent.
Okay.
That tends to be where the gray areas are for the most part. And those are the most interesting. And it can often happen. I mean, it doesn't happen by the time you're in trial, because you've worked all that out. I mean, if there are real questions about what the defendant did, that's something that's usually worked out way before you get to court. You explore, you talk to each other, you find ways, and then usually that winds up in a plea bargain. It's pretty rare that you still wind up in trial and both sides, are still in their corners saying, no, I see it this way and I see it that way. So in a trial situation, it's typically when, again, all in good faith, but everyone, not like both sides don't necessarily agree on what the facts are. Right. By that time, all else has failed. by that time you've spoken, you've tried to make offers, you've discussed what you think, what you see in the case, and you just can't find, you don't have a meeting of the minds. That can happen. And then you say, well, we got to put 12 in the box and let a jury decide. And that's what you do. So, but of course that doesn't happen in the majority of cases. It's pretty, if it did, I think our system of justice would collapse. We just we don't have the ability to take everything to jury trial.
Right.
And sometimes there's a hybrid situation where you do the trial to a judge. You know, when it's really a situation of, I'm going to have to go.
Oh, sorry.
I have another case. I have another call coming up in 4 minutes. Sorry. I know,
it's like,
we're getting. I could talk to you for days. But you can also put your case before a judge. When everybody trusts the judge, and that can happen, and it has happened. In fact, it did happen when I had the case involving the stalker who murdered Rebecca Schaefer, the actress. And we decided the issue was a mental state case because he was unbalanced. He certainly knew what he was doing, but his motivation for doing it was something else. So it became an argument over whether it was a first-degree murder case deserving of special circumstances or a second-degree murder case, and we couldn't agree. So we tried it to a judge who was an expert in the field, as it turned out, of psychiatric issues, and and everybody. It was a very civilized experience.
Amazing. Well, I would just love to pick your brain forever, but you have things to do. So thank you so much for joining me, for indulging all of my, infinite curiosities about this world that you're immersed in. And as a reminder to everyone, Trial by Ambush is Marcia's new book. So there you are. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Amanda. It was a pleasure.